on their own? The answer was, I'm not sure what you mean by consumption rampage. However, it's important to note that privilege is a systemic issue that has been perpetuated for centuries and is deeply ingrained in our society. It's not something that can be solved by individuals alone, but rather requires collective action and systemic change. 12. Privilege can be defined as a set of unearned benefits that are granted to certain groups of people based on their social identity too. It's important for individuals to recognize their privilege and work towards dismantling systemic oppression. 3. I wonder if change 12 in that response could denote the reducing of the number of households over 3,500 SF to one elected leader from each major discipline that I have included below in this report. People should be taught from preschool on to consistently examine whether or not their opinions are being manipulated as a basis for understanding public opinion from the perspective of providing/obtaining world welfare versus the unnecessary things to prioritize our goals, beginning with clean and green and with much less emphasis on mean and sheen, at the latest in civics class in 9th grade. I suggest preschool because shaping opinions begins before birth and it is the most widely used institutional tool, other than pollution, to corrupt the public opinion that shapes our governing policies. If institutions don't change, neither will families. Without this, it's like forcing children to have sex without a condom with a person who has a lethal virus while violating the fair chase law. It's actually worse. It's like shooting game in captivity without regard for diluting the strength of our genes. According to a recent article in the Smithsonian, South Africa is unwilling to rewild 10,000 lions now in captivity to West Africa, because they don't want to compromise the West African lion's genes, yet human genes have comparably been put through a milkshake blender at a big cost to the environment. All information that is collected must be governed to use public opinion to a globally combined benefit. Public opinion is the water that runs through our communication institutions to carry our cultural DNA to replicate our overall culture, and should be as well protected and maintained as the individual's circulation system is from outside forces. This includes giving all business enough scrutiny and accountability to accomplish that task. Change must be built in to allow for that, just as genes change to adapt before crises sets in under normal circumstances, but what normal is has become a monopoly of the privileged. As our current DNA dictates, that isn't even possible. That means freedom isn't possible for most, so people easily accept the consumption rampage in its stead. Currently, public opinion is manipulated on many fronts, including structural, psychological, and the physical. The immediate following is a broad overview of that from what I have observed, unofficially experimented with, and personal experience. Read on if you really want to understand the details about what's driving us and the environment into the ground. Later, I'll provide numbered points of solutions in this report to the President after his residential address section. I've progressed significantly in the last year, again with my own politically strategized catharsis, whose issues can only be resolved through a complete world plan, because I am among the most vulnerable, horribly oppressed, in this country, at rock bottom for most of my existence, for reasons mostly blocked by the fascists from becoming discernible to most, something I tried to help people realize since I was a young girl. They don't block it when the most vulnerable of us, who estimably comprise between 1 to 5% and possibly non-fascists in this country, appear to be most useful. It's a denial of the value of our conscripted non-paid roles as health care workers, guinea pigs, and time machines into everybody's health care, but that is when we are used for examples to herd people like sheep into the fascism factions and even deeper clandestine fascist subdivisions of any faction. That doesn't even include the bullying we incur from the non-humans created by chemical selection versus natural selection. It's like retraining them to be human. That's the mental health care field's responsibility. When possible, my daily comments on Twitter really sum up all of my best current evaluations, jokes, and writing, as much as I would publish here for relative brevity. Movies like The World According to Garp and Pleasantville are too surreal and depict a threshold of interaction we do not need to achieve on large scales, because people can be taught to love themselves, yet they are used to threaten and embarrass idealists while sadists are living their fantasy in full color. Some of my pertinent credentials are lifetime advocacy of civil rights for the socio-politically challenged unprivileged in the face of what's available to me, an almost complete fascist population, a bachelor's in social work, sober since 1988, have been processing oppression through professional psychological and social models since 1991, medical models since always, and perpetual experience and recovery as a severely oppressed, bullied, and severely disabled person with the desire to save the world. I only didn't profit from my prevention methods because the privileged fascists increase/d their bullying exponentially with robotic efficiency in response to any improvements I make. If they can help it, they don't want others to see there is another way. Here's a quick example of structural fascism at work destroying the environment and a life. I may not be as present during the summer because the horrible decrease in gradual natural water supply without a mechanized sprinkler system is allotting for most of my good weather time for farming oxygen. Additionally, my yard has been under attack for many years by fascists wasting my time to gentrify me out of the home I built myself, and my yard wouldn't require as much water intervention without their persistent vandalisms. These vandalisms are based on what the privileged, including elders, mobsters, police, and justice system have led them to or allowed for. I have made at least 30 attempts with those systems. They are literally throwing water out the window and more chemicals into the environment. Like the fascist wealthy globally, I think they can't wait for environment, and the mass migration of consumers will probably get from it, eventually replacing our pollution weakened and or decimated by environment population. The report is an existence-long project for me and the key to our survival and the ability for all to thrive instead of just the elite. It's about correcting our cultural DNA that instructs all institutions and therefore most people, along with much stress to our public opinion institutions, to comply immediately. If the white supremacists were being totally honest with themselves and us, I think they would agree that all our issues stem from global fascism. It's about correcting our cultural DNA that instructs all institutions and therefore most people. That addresses the systemic and male-centrist nature of our culture together. Most of my blogs relate to the same issue of saving the world, with an emphasis and support on /for replacing the current unconstitutionally institutionalized fascism's DNA, overemphasis on libido and territorialism, gender centrism, with the cultural DNA of the health and welfare of all people and the environment. Common sense but needs bettered by undeniable sense. I think the quickest way is to use affirmative action from both ends and the middle. World welfare for all. Taxation should be the middle ground and should include all encumbrances people incur and lifetime income, but it's of the utmost importance to discover how intangible encumbrances are dealt with. Tax evasion is one way, as is bullying, and this is exactly why we have the gifts of deducement and formulas like algorithms and extrapolations to discern all of them fairly and equally for all people to benefit, not just the privileged. Lastly, affirmative action needs to address all people's overindulgences. This will help resolve all issues simultaneously without the excesses that the elite seem to guarantee other elites across all factions across all countries when they supposedly make civil progress which protects them but creates environment-killing consumption rampages, younger prostitutes, and helps fuel wars that seem to begin at the end of each rampage. It is a fatal form of taxation without representation. This is an ancient issue already proven to not work. It helps fascist civilizations in the beginning and crushes them in the end while preserving many of the privileges' feudal kingdoms. Why is fascism fine and dandy enough to ensure that men have enough sex and property to obtain credit for securing our nation's borders and their sycophants' lives, but not to allow for enough United States naturally born citizens to be healthy and rational enough to secure said nation's borders and interests abroad by allowing all to share in the progress? Because we get smart. Public opinion is partially thwarted from this in our daily lives easily by pairing better rights for women and the disabled with allowing more freedom of addiction-causing substances, making it appear that the chaos they create comes from better adherence to the Constitution. I think this prevents self-disciplined people and dedicated religious people from changing their perspective on the issues, a clear manipulation of public opinion. It's because of the lack of focus on world welfare. In its place we have a progressive party which still isn't about world welfare. It still leads to prioritizing in a way that leads to bigger problems and injustices to other factions and those who don't even have a faction, as it always has. It's tyranny to brainwash our youth into believing that the progress that does exist is already shared, while other sources say progress is abundant, to substantiate status quo policies in order to belay subsistence. The privileged just keep moving on like we want to starve to death. I don't see progress anywhere except maybe in combat techniques if you can call killing versus the best defense progress, but those people need to give up some of their wealth as do all the elite. It belays undeniable sense. To arrive there, we the people must insist that all leaders manage and distribute the progress better, and most of that relies on public opinion. Institutionally, that begins in preschool. Defense not war is half the equation. Peace is the other, and that takes world welfare. It appears that most privileged either don't want to share the freedom or are in denial of the fact that the people that could create a true democracy are not given opportunity. I saw, see, heard, and continue to hear proof of this in my own familial atom, that the privileged really believe everybody has the same opportunity. The same people are still in denial of the severity of my disability, the same denial that removed any chance of me developing an adult body unto this date. They and our leaders lack the undeniable sense to use their common sense. This is tyranny at its most base point, denying subsistence to those who would learn to stop it beginning in their youth and before birth if possible. This is taxation without representation, adding a much worse form than what John Adams spoke of, aimed at non-fascist children, specifically. I say unto you, I was suspect of desiring to complete the stretching of our Constitution before I was born. People are hurting themselves and creating more victims of us and our environment to be better fascists instead of giving a hoot about the environment because they are rewarded with attention, power, and much more. Children committed to fascism are rewarded with control at the very least, in their youth. This isn't about fashion. This is real policy changing stuff, the stuff that has run neck and neck with civil rights, which has enabled Trump and others to create the following they have. I am a witness to the dual combination of word boarding and silence in my own familial atom, pillars of the community, where children manipulate adults into being even worse fascists by subscribing to, enabling, or both what may just look like childish and not so childish addictions. This is their reward for taking the reins through new addictions in crime, sex, drugs, and music at the least. These are aimed, specifically, at glossing over subsistence issues. I did the drug and alcohol scene. It was kind of like ghosting it, infiltrating enemy lines but only to survive by giving their way a chance. I just didn't stop advocating. It is not possible. Rewarding these youth while punishing those with pure intentions allows the young privileged fascists enough popularity to phase out environment and social issues from a young age. Addictions need to be addressed in preschool along with the public opinion issues that stop the non-fascist youth from succeeding. But the unamenable factors most boys face are outgunned by those heaped on young girls, which leads us to the roots of oppression and environment's consumption rampage. The two biggest factors the privileged employ in controlling public opinion from birth are unconstitutional. The censure of the details of the existence and functions of the psycracy's role in oppressing non-fascists is probably the second biggest Machiavellian manipulation in the privilege's consumption rampage toolbox after exploiting little girls and girl-like adults' pheromones. This prevents young people's health and welfare perspective from, often ever, flowering while stimulating early estrus and sex-focused relationships. Like robotic fish and subservient to AI, the control of both factors determines who, when, where, how and what we swim for. If the goal was the health and welfare of all people and the environment, saving the world would probably be non deliberare, not necessary to consider, by now. The use of algorithms are not rooted in the digital world or humanity. As it is, it creates so much more addiction and so much harm to people's genomes. The privileged have to continually import more immigrants to cover the low productivity and disability factors. This, in turn, creates higher, non-viable population levels that want their own cheap labor. You can't consider buying more things than a normal household requires, part of productivity. Yet, keeping up with normal household requirements is part of productivity for many severely disabled people, but the privileged usurp that standing from us by using the pity of not being able to manage it all on their own to get support for using more labor for that management and to have more time for more overindulgences, effectively, stealing our subsistence. It's like a quadruple standard or more for the disabled because they do that by manipulating public opinion to begin with. I doubt Machiavelli pointed that one out. The consumption rampage begins here. Pheromones from mother are a normal level of sexual stimulant for our youth and lead to normal mating habits when paired with adequate subsistence. Sex is a powerful tool of persuasion and doubles as slave candy at no initial cost to the consumer. This is from my own experience, what I've observed, what I've studied and read, and what I can professionally deduce with common sense. Keep in mind everything the privileged do to be privileged is bullying by sheer definition, below. Pheromonal smells from young tortured 9-year-old girls helped to create the consumption rampages, including overpopulation, in this country just as it gets people to work to death in China. Some choose to rampage to not rape us physically in response, while others do that and choose the deep dark dungeons of our minds to hurl that whip at us as well. I don't hear the faction, me too, speaking of this. Bullies stimulate the involuntary early flowering of young girls, Def 1, when they are rejected by many in the community, and other forms of bullying. It's a defense mechanism to help us survive. I can speak for one when I testify that it can be counteracted with an equal defensive, Def 2, strategy of covering up. Well, it worked in my youth. Def 1 possibly developed when we were fish or later to help mothers find their lost or confused young. Today, if you are a world welfarer and your siblings are sexually stimulated anyway, they may choose even more abuse to distance themselves from you, increasing the pheromonal output even more, and may necessitate the bullies diversifying his addictions rather than apologizing and making amends. They can only be whole that way. The snake eats its own tail otherwise, and they get paid by the consumption rampagers to do just that. Def 3 is when the victim is so embarrassed by the damage done to her physique, she voluntarily removes herself from the love game, covers up, and prevents further enabling by disallowing budding sadists from enjoying the damages. Def 4 came for me when I couldn't speak a word to my abusers without showing pain due to my malnutrition's side effects of depression and anxiety, which rolled into anger. I literally stopped talking to all 5 of my brothers because I need more from family than anger. They couldn't stand it. They actually felt entitled to see me squirm and tried to get my parents to force me to speak to them. They allowed my defense back then. My methods worked for a long time while they still had some inkling of undeniable sense, and I began talking to them after they softened a little but re-hardened again later when my ex flew the coup, along with what support I could muster from any family or community members. Support group support faded as well. The ones still alive and my neighbors resorted to the old ways to this day of expecting to see me squirm and acting as though they are entitled to that pleasure. They fail to comprehend that undeniable sense is not optional. All men are created equal. Without this sense, all we are left with is fascism. This must be similar to how the fascists helped Eve look evil. Even the Microsoft program I'm writing in keeps highlighting things, whole paragraphs, and sometimes completely erases them with so much consistency. It must be making the surveying algorithm robots think I am really mental. I have to double-click where single is the setting constantly. This issue lightened up after I wrote this, but they picked up on misspelling things I already corrected. I forgot to mention that. Not enforcing laws creates more addiction in anybody, especially our youth, and it allows the masters of public opinion